The storm rolled across the prairie like an army marching to war, its thunder rattling the windows of an old wooden house that had stood against 50 years of wind and time. Inside, Samuel Garrett sat by the fire, listening. He had heard countless tempests in his lifetime, but something about this one felt different, too alive, too urgent, as if it carried more than rain on its back. Then came the sound that didn't belong to the storm, the frantic rhythm of hooves tearing through mud, drawing closer until they stopped dead at his door. A knock followed, not a polite tap, but a pounding born of desperation, as though the person outside feared drowning more than offending. Samuel opened the door, and in the frame stood a woman so soaked she seemed carved from the rain itself. A black dress clung to her thin frame, her dark hair plastered to her face like mourning veils. She gripped the reins of a horse that looked ready to collapse and raised her eyes to him, eyes that carried the weight of too many storms endured. "Please," she whispered. Just one word, but it carried the bruises of past refusals, the exhaustion of someone who had begged before and been turned away. Samuel had never touched a woman in his life. 50 years, and his hands knew only the language of earth, leather, and iron. Yet something in her shattered every wall he had built. Maybe because she wasn't asking for pity. She was bargaining for survival. Without speaking, he stepped aside. She crossed the threshold, dripping water onto the floor he had scrubbed alone for decades. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said, removing a soaked hat and revealing a face shaped by hardship, but unbroken by it. "I've been a widow for 3 months. My husband died and left me with debts I didn't even know existed." Samuel closed the door, but not his heart. He could already tell this woman wasn't here just for shelter. She carried a story soaked in betrayal and danger. A woman reduced to a ledger entry, pursued by men who wanted payment in flesh. "They told me I could settle the debt." "Another way," Clara murmured, and Samuel understood without her saying more. Outside, the storm roared like a wounded beast. Inside, silence settled, a silence heavy with the knowledge of two people who had lived too long alone. Samuel because he had chosen solitude, Clara because the world had chosen to treat her like property. When she slipped off her rain-soaked cloak, Samuel saw the outline of a woman for the first time in his home. But what stirred inside him wasn't desire. It was something deeper, something far more terrifying. Recognition. One wounded soul finding another. "You don't owe me an explanation," Samuel said at last, his voice rougher than usual. "Here, no one pays for shelter." Clara looked at him like he had promised that the sun would rise in the west. For 3 long months, since the day they buried her husband, no one had given her anything without attaching a price. Her dignity, her body, her freedom. Samuel fetched a blanket and draped it over her shoulders, then poured coffee that steamed like hope in the cold air. When his hands brushed her arms, a jolt ran through him. 50 years of solitude had not prepared him for the electric shock of simple human closeness. "You're not going to ask me anything," she said softly, warming her hands on the cup. "What you want to share, you will. What you want to keep, you keep." Outside, the rain kept falling, but inside, something was shifting. Clara had found a man who didn't see weakness as an opportunity. Samuel had found a woman who didn't see loneliness as a flaw. If you've ever fought to hold on to dignity in a world that tried to price your worth, then you know this night was never about rain. It was about two strangers learning that sometimes salvation walks in dripping wet and exhausted. And for the first time in years, neither Samuel nor Clara felt alone. "Do you know why I stayed that night?" Clara asked, her voice calm but carrying the weight of unspoken truths. She stirred the spoon slowly in the bowl, as if buying herself a moment. Samuel lifted his eyes, curious, but said nothing. "It wasn't because I was desperate," she continued. "It was because when you opened that door, you didn't look at me the way other men did. You didn't see my body as currency. You didn't measure my despair like a bargaining chip. You looked at me, Samuel, in the eyes, as if I were someone, not a problem, not a debt, someone." Samuel froze with the spoon halfway to his mouth. He wanted to speak, but Clara raised her hand, asking for silence just a little longer. "For 17 years, she said softly, my husband saw me as a function. Cook, clean, lie down when he wanted. After he died, the men with ledgers saw me as payment. And then there was you." Her eyes glistened. "You were the first man who looked at me and saw Clara Whitmore. The person." She smiled, and Samuel realized it was the first genuine smile he had seen since the night she arrived. "And now?" he asked quietly. Clara drew a deep breath. "Now, Samuel. Now I don't dream about falling anymore. I dream about flying." He reached across the table, his hand rough, calloused, but steady. She took it without hesitation. "Then let's fly together," he said. "If you've ever been treated like a transaction when all you wanted was to be seen, you'll understand." This moment wasn't about romance. It was about dignity. Two people deciding they would never again settle for less than they deserved. That night, Clara didn't lock her bedroom door. Not because she expected Samuel to come in, but because for the first time in years, she trusted a man not to. The danger returned on a Tuesday morning. Clara saw them first, 3 riders cutting across the horizon, raising a trail of dust like a warning. She froze, every muscle tightening. For a month she had believed she was safe, that the past had been buried with Thomas. But no, the dust told another story. "Samuel!" she called, but he was already striding from the corral, eyes hard as hammered steel. The man in front wore an oily smile and a suit too fine for this country road, Cornelius Blake. His name was a curse whispered in back rooms. Behind him came 2 enforcers, a scarred redhead and a dark-haired man with a revolver swinging at his hip like an unspoken threat. "Mrs. Whitmore," Blake said, tipping his hat in a gesture so polished it reeked of mockery. "At last we meet. We've got unfinished business." Clara stayed on the porch close to the door. Samuel stepped up beside her, a wall of quiet strength. "Unfinished business, is that so?" Samuel said, his voice low and edged with iron. "Then hear me clear. This woman is under my protection. If you've got legal matters, find a judge. Financial matters, go to a bank. But here," his hand hovered near the rifle leaning against the wall, "here's no place for intimidation." Blake's smile widened, revealing teeth yellowed by whiskey. "Garrett, you don't strike me as a man who can afford to make enemies. You sure you want to bleed for a widow who ain't even yours?" Samuel didn't flinch. He didn't blink. And Clara realized then what loyalty looked like when it wasn't bought, when it wasn't chained by obligation. It was fierce, it was quiet, and it was ready to burn the world down if needed. That evening, Clara opened her leather-bound journal, a habit she had recently revived. Her pen glided across the page as she wrote, "Today, I wasn't just the widow living under Samuel's roof. Today, I was Clara Morrison, co-owner of Terra Firma Ranch, a woman who plants seeds and builds futures. For years, Thomas told me I was God's mistake. Today, I discovered I'm not a mistake. I'm a work in progress." She set the journal aside and gazed out the window toward the vegetable garden she had planted with her own hands. Tiny green shoots would appear in a few weeks, fragile yet determined. They weren't just plants, they were proof that a new life was taking root. Clara Morrison had stopped merely surviving. She was beginning to thrive. The illusion of peace shattered on a Tuesday morning. A knock on the door revealed a nervous young courier holding an envelope with an embossed seal she recognized immediately. The law firm representing Thomas's creditors. Her hands trembled as she broke the wax, but her voice was steady when she read aloud. "You are hereby summoned to appear before the county court in 2 weeks regarding the outstanding debts of the late Thomas Whitmore. Failure to appear will result in a warrant for your arrest." Samuel leaned over her shoulder, his jaw tightening. This time they made it look real. Court seal, Judge Henderson's signature. "You know this judge?" Clara asked. Samuel nodded grimly. "He has a reputation. He sides with businessmen over women without protectors. But he respects the law if it's presented right." Clara folded the letter with precise movements. "Then we'll present the law correctly." The next morning, Clara saddled her horse. Samuel offered to ride with her, but she shook her head. "I need to do this alone. I need to prove to myself that I can fight my own battles." Her destination was a modest office above the general store, the practice of Miriam Santos, the only female attorney for miles around. Miriam, a formidable woman of Mexican heritage who had clawed her way through law school despite every prejudice imaginable, specialized in defending women and immigrants no one else would represent. "Senora Morrison," Miriam said, after examining the papers Clara brought. "First, we establish your identity. You said you've started using your maiden name." "Yes, but only personally. Nothing official." "We'll make it official. Under Texas law, a widow may legally reclaim her maiden name with a formal declaration. That's step one." As Miriam drafted the paperwork, she continued, "Second, spousal debt liability. By law, you're only responsible for debts you knew about and consented to. Can you prove ignorance?" Clara opened a folder. "I've got bank statements, store ledgers, and sworn statements from 3 people who knew about the gambling, people Thomas forbade me from speaking to, including the parish priest." Miriam scanned the documents, impressed. "You're well prepared," Clara gave a wry smile. 17 years with a man who hid money teaches you to pay attention. "Third," Miriam continued, "we prove you have independent means. Show me documentation of your co-ownership of the ranch." Clara produced the deed Samuel had signed over to her. Miriam leaned back, admiration in her eyes. "Lady, you're more organized than half the men who hire me." "I still need you," Clara replied. "I know they'll use every trick in the book, and I need someone who knows the law better than they do." For the next 2 weeks, they worked tirelessly, drafting motions, gathering evidence, studying statutes. Clara memorized precedents, prepared cross-examinations, and assembled a case that not only proved her innocence, but showcased her independence. On the day of the hearing, she walked into the courthouse in her best black dress, not as a frightened widow, but as a woman who knew her rights. Samuel sat in the front row beside several local women who had come to support her, inspired by the whispers of what Clara was attempting. The creditor's lawyer, Cornelius Blake, looked smug as he spread his stack of papers across the table. 2 men stood ready to testify that Clara knew about Thomas's gambling. Judge Henderson, a bald man with heavy glasses, called the court to order. Blake opened confidently. "Your Honor, this is simple. Mrs. Whitmore was married to Thomas when these debts were incurred. Under marital law, she is responsible. We have witnesses who will confirm her knowledge of these wagers." One by one, Blake's witnesses testified until Miriam's questions unraveled them. Their stories clashed, timelines contradicted. One claimed Clara attended a poker game in 1873. The other swore she lent money for bets in 1874. Clara's documents showed she had been out of state caring for her sick sister throughout 1873. When her turn came, Clara rose, hands steady on a meticulously organized stack of evidence. "Your Honor, my name is Clara Morrison," she began. "I have legally reclaimed my maiden name to assert my identity separate from the late Thomas Whitmore." She laid out bank statements proving she never accessed gambling funds, affidavits from merchants confirming she always paid in cash, and a signed statement from the parish priest attesting that Thomas confessed hiding his gambling from her. "Most importantly," Clara continued, "I present proof that I am co-owner of Terra Firme Ranch with legitimate means of support. I am not a destitute widow evading responsibility. I am a self-reliant citizen asserting my legal rights." The judge studied each page carefully. Blake's confidence eroded with every document. "Mr. Blake," Judge Henderson finally said, "these exhibits are compelling. Do you have anything further?" Blake grasped at straws. "Even if she didn't know, Your Honor, she still benefited from the money. She ate the food, lived under the roof bought with those funds." Clara rose again before the judge could reply. "By that logic, every child whose parent commits a crime should be punished for eating supper. I was not an accomplice, Your Honor. I was deceived." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Clara pressed on, her voice steady. "Furthermore, I question the legitimacy of these creditors. Lending for gambling is itself a legally dubious enterprise. Can they prove their dealings were lawful?" Blake paled. The judge leaned back, impressed. "Mrs. Morrison, your preparation is exceptional. Mr. Blake, your client's position is compromised, perhaps fatally." Blake tried one last desperate argument, but the gavel fell with finality. "I rule in favor of Mrs. Clara Morrison. She bears no responsibility for Thomas Whitmore's debts." Any further attempts at collection will constitute harassment punishable by law." Applause thundered. Clara's knees weakened, but she walked out with her head high. Outside, Samuel embraced her. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to cry. Not in defeat, but in triumph. "You were magnificent," he whispered. "We were," she corrected softly. "You gave me the ground to stand on." Miriam joined them with a wide smile. "Clara, you just set a precedent. Women will remember this." That same week, Clara made another bold move. She officially launched Morrison & Comer's, a domestic goods business specializing in preserves and fine sewing. Her first order came from the banker's wife, the second from the general store. Soon she was keeping ledgers by lamplight, Samuel watching with pride. "You're building an empire," he teased. "I'm building freedom," Clara replied. "I want every woman trapped like I was to know there is a way out." She turned one room of the house into an office, advising women for free, teaching them to read contracts, open bank accounts, and gather evidence in abuse cases. Samuel watched her one evening and said, "You're becoming a lawyer in your own right." Clara smiled. "I'm becoming what I needed when I had no one." Weeks later, Blake made one last attempt to intimidate her, only to find Clara on the porch, rifle in hand, calm as the wind. "Leave now," she said evenly, "or you'll learn the hard way what Texas law says about trespass and assault." Blake saw the steel in her eyes and fled. That night, Clara wrote in her journal. Weeks later, Blake made one last attempt to intimidate her, only to find Clara on the porch, rifle in hand, calm as the wind. "Leave now," she said evenly, "or you'll learn the hard way what Texas law says about trespass and assault." Blake saw the steel in her eyes and fled. That night, Clara wrote in her journal. Clara's voice was calm, almost serene. "Of course it could, which is why I brought this as well." From her leather satchel, she pulled a second envelope, heavier, thicker, final. When Blake opened it, the color drained from his face. "This," Clara said, her tone like steel sliding from a sheath, "is an updated deed of ownership. Terra Firme Ranch now belongs jointly to Samuel and Clara Garrett, legal spouses. 50% of this land bears my name." Samuel stepped forward, producing his own folder. "And here," he said, "is the business license for Morrison & Co., a legitimate, fully registered enterprise operating on this property with municipal and state approval." Blake's jaw tightened. His silence was the sound of plans collapsing. But Clara wasn't finished. She placed one last document on the table like a gambler laying down the winning hand. "And finally, gentlemen, a court order, issued yesterday. It forbids any individual from harassing, threatening, or attempting to remove Clara Garrett from her lawful property under penalty of imprisonment for violation of civil rights." The Reverend and Blake stared at the papers as if they were staring at a noose tightening around their own throats. Everything was real, stamped, sealed, unassailable. "This marriage," Blake began, his voice breaking under the weight of panic. "You can't have married—" "You didn't know," Clara cut in sharply, her words sharp as shattered glass. "You assumed I'd sit idle while you plotted my ruin. You assumed a woman couldn't outthink you. You assumed wrong." The Reverend tried his last sermon. "Even married, madam, you owe obedience." "Reverend," Clara's voice sliced through his hypocrisy like a blade through silk. "My only duty before God is to live with integrity, compassion, and courage. Qualities you wouldn't recognize if they were branded on your forehead." Samuel moved closer, a wall of strength beside her. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice low but loaded with threat, "this conversation is over. You're trespassing. Leave now before I exercise my rights as owner." Blake's mouth twisted, but his eyes darted like a cornered animal. "This isn't over," he hissed. Clara took one deliberate step forward, and for the first time since setting foot on her land, Blake recoiled. Her eyes burned, not with fear, but with something far more dangerous: resolve. "Oh, Mr. Blake," she said, her voice ringing like a church bell at midnight, "this ends exactly here, exactly now. You lost. You thought I was fragile glass, but I am iron. You tried to break me and failed." She leaned in, her words as cold as a coffin nail. "You sold me like cattle, hunted me like an outlaw, branded me immoral. But you didn't shatter me. You forged me, stronger, unbreakable." Her hand swept toward the gate. "You have 2 minutes to get off my land. And Blake, if you or your men ever return, I won't call the sheriff. I'll handle it myself." The Reverend's hands trembled as he stuffed his forged contracts back into his satchel. "You'll regret defying men of God," he rasped. "Men of God don't blackmail widows," Clara shot back. "Men of God don't forge documents or destroy families. You're not men of God. You're men of greed and stolen robes. And I fear nothing from men like you." Blake mounted his horse, his voice hollow with defeat. "You may have won this time." Clara's final words hit like an anvil striking iron. "I didn't win this time, Blake. I won forever. The moment I stopped being your victim and became my own salvation." They rode away in silence, a storm of dust marking the death of their schemes. Clara stood at the porch, Samuel beside her, watching until the horizon swallowed them whole. "Mrs. Garrett," Samuel said, a slow smile tugging at his lips, "you're a formidable woman." She turned to him, her eyes blazing with triumph. "And you, Mr. Garrett, are my equal." She kissed him softly, sealing a victory that was more than legal. It was personal. That night, they celebrated more than a battle won. They celebrated transformation. Clara was no longer the desperate widow who knocked on a stranger's door in the rain. She was Clara Garrett, landowner, entrepreneur, wife, unstoppable force. 6 months later, winter came gently, as if the earth itself honored the peace that had settled over Terra Firme Ranch. Clara sat on the porch in a December sunset, knitting a small blanket while watching Samuel mend the corral fence with the same precision she had grown to love. Half a year had passed since the showdown with Blake. 6 months of silence from their enemies. 6 months of business growth. 6 months of a marriage that began as a practical alliance and bloomed into something deeper. Clara's hand rested on her belly, slightly rounded. At 38, after 17 barren years, life was stirring within her. Not from obligation, not from fear, but from love freely given and received. Samuel didn't know yet. Clara had discovered it only a week ago when missed cycles and morning sickness told a story she hardly dared to dream true. She savored the secret, letting it warm her like the winter fire. Thomas had told her she was cursed by God. Blake had treated her as a commodity. But now, carrying Samuel's child, Clara understood. Her body had never been broken. The world had been. Fear kills life. Love creates it. Samuel finished his work and walked toward her, the setting sun painting his silhouette gold. She saw the strength in his stride, but also the tenderness in his eyes. "How was your day?" he asked, kissing her forehead. "Productive," she smiled. 6 jars of preserves for the hotel order, 2 shirts for Dr. Peterson's boy. He grinned. "You'll end up the richest woman in the county." "We'll end up the most prosperous couple in Texas," she corrected. "Your cattle thrive. My goods sell out. We're a family business now." They rocked in silence, the horizon bleeding orange and crimson. Clara's gaze swept over the thriving garden, the weathered sign reading Terra Firme, the curtains she sewed, the flowers she planted. Everything here whispered one truth. "This is home, Samuel," she said softly. "There's something I need to tell you." He turned, sensing the gravity in her voice. "Remember when you said I gave you life again?" "I remember." "Well," she smiled, tears glimmering. "Seems you gave me life too, literally." It took him a moment, then his eyes widened. "Clara, you're saying..." "I'm saying you're going to be a father." He froze, then pulled her into his arms. Tears spilled, joy, grief, everything lost and everything found. "Are you scared?" she whispered. "Terrified," he admitted, "and the happiest I've been in 20 years. She held his hand. "We'll face it together, like everything else." He kissed her knuckles reverently. "Clara Garrett, you're a miracle." "No," she said, smiling through tears. "I'm a woman who finally found the right soil to bloom." That night after supper, Clara wrote in her journal, December 1875. Today I told Samuel about the baby. We're not just building a family. We're building a future where a child will grow up knowing women are never property, love is never control, and dignity is never negotiable. A year ago, I was Clara Whitmore, a widow running from ruin. Today, I am Clara Garrett, owner, wife, mother-to-be. I did not change by miracle. I changed because someone saw me as I truly was, and because I decided never to be less again. Spring brought Hope. That was her name. Hope Morrison Garrett, born with her mother's green eyes and her father's iron spirit. She would never know a world that told her to shrink. Years later, women traveled miles to terra firma seeking refuge, advice, proof that reinvention was possible. Clara welcomed them with strong tea and stronger words. She wrote a booklet, The Woman's Landowner's Manual, a quiet revolution disguised as ink and paper. Blake died forgotten. The Reverend faded into disgrace. Samuel became a legend, a man who proved strength, thrives in partnership, not domination. But Clara's greatest victory wasn't defeating men like Blake. It was raising children who never doubted their worth, never saw violence masquerading as love, never believed freedom had to be earned by obedience. On a golden evening, Clara sat on her porch, watching Hope teach her dolls about dignity, while Samuel read to their son Thomas. The ranch was no longer just land. It was a sanctuary, a symbol. Clara looked at the sky, the horizon that once felt like a cage, now endless as possibility. I didn't rebuild my life, she thought. I forged it in fire. And as the stars pierced the Texas night, Clara Garrett whispered the truth that had carried her through every storm. No one decides who you are but you. No past defines you. No man owns you. If they try to break you, let them try, because you are iron,